The smell hit him first, the way it always did after a long night in the studio, that sharp chemical bite of spray, fixative and architectural adhesive that had worked itself so deep into the fibers of his jacket that no amount of washing ever fully got it out. Marcus Webb had stopped noticing it months ago, the same way you stop noticing the weight of a backpack you wear every single day. But tonight, sliding into the driver's seat of his 2009 Chevy Malibu at 10:48 p.m., he caught a fresh wave of it and almost laughed because it smelled like work, and work was the one thing in his life that had never once let him down. He was 19 years old and he was exhausted in the specific bone-deep way that only comes from doing something you genuinely love for far too many hours in a row. His architecture seminar had run until 5, and then he had stayed in the studio until almost 11, finishing the physical model for his midterm project, a community health clinic designed for a low-income neighborhood, which was not a coincidence because Marcus Webb did not do anything by accident. He was a pre-med sophomore on a full academic scholarship at the state university, and he had chosen architecture as his studio elective, because he believed with the quiet certainty of someone who had thought about it carefully that the buildings people lived in and got sick in and tried to heal in were just as important as the medicines they were given inside them. The Malibu started on the 3rd try, which was normal. The driver's side window stuck halfway down for a moment before he coaxed it the rest of the way, which was also normal. The rear right speaker had blown sometime in October and produced a faint crackling buzz underneath the bass frequencies of whatever he was playing, which he had long since learned to hear as texture rather than malfunction. His father had offered him something better, twice a newer car, a cleaner car, something that would not draw a second look. And Marcus had said no both times, not out of stubbornness, but out of something closer to principle, a deliberate, considered choice to move through the world in a way that kept him honest about what things cost and how hard they were to earn. He pressed play on the CD player, an actual CD, John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, which his father had given him when he was 14, with the explanation that some music needed to have weight to it, needed to be something you held in your hands, and that streaming was fine for background noise. But this particular record deserved better than that, and let the opening notes fill the car as he pulled out of the university parking structure and onto the access road. He texted his mother before he left the lot, which he did every night without exception, not because she required it, but because she worried and worrying was something she had earned the right to do. Heading home. Maybe 35 minutes. Love you. She replied within seconds, which meant she had been awake waiting, which meant she would be asleep on the couch by the time he got there, which was a form of love he had grown up understanding as completely as he understood anything. The fastest route from campus to their downtown apartment cut through Hargrove Estates, a sprawling, immaculate suburb on the northwestern edge of the city that was characterized by towering old-growth oaks, lawns maintained with surgical precision, iron gates half hidden by carefully trimmed hedgerows, and a particular quality of silence at night that was less like peace and more like a held breath. Marcus did not live there. He drove through it because it was 12 minutes faster than the bypass, and 12 minutes when you are 19 and exhausted and have a 7 a.m. lab is not a small thing. He had made this drive 40, maybe 50 times since the semester started. He knew every turn, every speed limit sign, every amber streetlight. He knew which intersections had cameras and which did not, though knowing had nothing to do with behavior. His speed was the same either way, his signals were always used, his stops at the painted white lines were always complete. His father's voice had been part of his driving since he was old enough to sit in the passenger seat and watch Damon Webb demonstrate with characteristic methodical thoroughness every element of operating a vehicle in a way that left absolutely no room for interpretation or ambiguity. You are going to drive better than anyone else on the road, his father had told him, not as a wish, but as an instruction. Not because you have to, but because the cost of not doing so is higher for us than it is for other people. And I need you to understand that difference the way you understand your own name. Marcus had understood. He had understood at 12 sitting at the kitchen table, while his father walked him through a list of what to do if red and blue lights appeared in his mirror. And he understood now at 19, in the same way you understand the multiplication tables, not because you think about them, but because they are simply part of the structure of how your mind works. He was 4 minutes from home, still on Hargrove Boulevard, still following the coal train, still thinking about the clinic model and whether the load-bearing calculation on the south wall was going to give his professor something to push back on, when he noticed the cruiser. It was parked in the shadow of a long hedgerow on Langford Drive, nose out, dark, the engine off, or idling so quietly he could not tell the difference. He noticed it the way you notice a dog behind a fence when you are walking past, a flicker of awareness, a subconscious recalibration of your posture. He checked his speedometer 31 in a 35. He checked his signal off because he had no turn to make. He checked his lane perfectly centered. He exhaled slowly and let his shoulders drop back down from wherever they had drifted. The coal train played. The streetlights passed overhead in their slow amber rhythm. Marcus thought about the south wall, and then the headlights in his rear-view mirror came on wide and white and very close, and his stomach dropped the way it always did, the way it had been dropping since he was 12 years old. Not from guilt, but from something older and more complicated than guilt, something that had been handed down to him along with the knowledge of how to drive and the number to call if everything went wrong. He had done everything right. He always did everything right. The cruiser pulled out of Langford Drive and fell in behind him, closed deliberate, the engine's low growl filling the space between them like something alive. Officer Wade Pruitt had been on the road for 11 years before he stopped thinking of himself as a public servant and started thinking of himself as something more like a custodian, a man responsible for maintaining a particular order that the people who lived in Hargrove Estates paid their property taxes for and expected to receive without having to think about it too carefully. He did not phrase it that way, even to himself, because Pruitt was not a man who spent a great deal of time examining the architecture of his own thinking. He operated on instinct, which is what he called it, and experience, which is also what he called it, and if those two things happened to produce the same result in the same kinds of situations, involving the same kinds of people, well, that was just what 16 years on the road did to you. He was 44 years old, built like a man who had once been in excellent shape, and had allowed that shape to slowly renegotiate its terms over the better part of a decade. He had a wide, square face, sandy hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of permanent slight squint that comes from years of shining a flashlight into cars at night and deciding in the space of 3 seconds what kind of person was behind the wheel. He was good at those 3-second decisions, or at least he had never been made to doubt them in any meaningful way, which amounted to the same thing as far as he was concerned. Sitting in the passenger seat, Officer Cole Tanner was 26 years old and 8 months into his career, which meant he was still in his probationary period, which meant that in all the ways that practically mattered, he served at the pleasure of whoever sat beside him in that cruiser. He had come into this job with intentions that he would have called idealistic if pressed, though he would have said it quickly and followed it with a self-deprecating joke. Because idealism was not a quality that held high status in the culture of the Hargrove precinct, and Cole Tanner had learned in 8 months to be very careful about what he made visible. He was good-looking in an unremarkable way, with an open face that had not yet acquired the practiced hardness that Pruitt wore like a second uniform. And when he had started this job, he had imagined in the vague and generous way of young people who have not yet run up against the specific texture of institutions that he would be the kind of officer who made a difference in the way the phrase was usually meant fairly decently, person by person. 8 months with Wade. Pruitt had not destroyed that self-image entirely, but it had done something perhaps worse, which was to teach him the habit of putting it away, of folding it up and sliding it into a drawer somewhere behind his ribs, where it would not interfere with the business of getting through a shift without incident, where incident was defined specifically as anything that caused Pruitt to look at him with that particular expression of patient contempt. There, Pruitt said, his voice low and unhurried, as the Malibu rolled through the intersection ahead of them, the red taillights precise and unhurried in the dark street. He was not pointing at anything. He was simply indicating a direction of attention the way a hunter indicates a movement in the tree line, with the stillness of someone who has been paying a specific kind of attention for a very long time. Tanner looked. He saw a car obeying the speed limit in both the letter and the spirit, using no turns, maintaining its lane with the neatness of someone who was either a careful driver or very much aware of being watched. He looked at the driver, what he could see of him, young, dark-skinned, relaxed but attentive behind the wheel. He looked at the car, a Malibu, not new, with a dented rear quarter panel and a bumper sticker from the State University on the lower left corner of the back windshield. He did not see what Pruitt saw, but he had learned in 8 months that saying so was a form of confrontation that cost more than it purchased. "Wrong side of town for that car," Pruitt said, and reached forward to key the radio. He was already moving, already reorienting his body toward the door, already in the mode that Tanner had come to recognize as the transition from waiting to acting, a mode that Pruitt entered the way other men entered a room they owned. The violation Pruitt called in was a lane deviation. The Malibu's passenger side rear tire had grazed the solid white line as it moved through the intersection. A contact so brief and so minor that Tanner, who had been watching, was not entirely certain it had happened, and was more certain that if it had no reasonable officer conducting a good-faith stop would have considered it sufficient grounds. But he said nothing. He reached for the door handle as the cruiser pulled out, the engine rising from its idle to something more aggressive, and he felt in his chest the specific dread of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has not yet found the version of himself brave enough to not go there. The lights went on, and the dark road became loud with color, and Tanner thought briefly, clearly, and then not at all. Something about tonight feels different. He put the thought in the drawer and closed it. The lights hit the rear-view mirror, and Marcus Webb's stomach dropped in the way it had been dropping since he was 12 years old. Not from guilt, never from guilt, but from something that lived beneath guilt, something older and more physical, a reflex so deeply worn into his nervous system that it operated faster than conscious thought, faster than the reassurance he immediately began reciting to himself in his father's voice. "You have done nothing wrong." His speed was 31. His lane was clean. His signal had not been needed. He had stopped fully at the last intersection weight on the brake bumper behind the line. He had done nothing wrong, and the lights were still in his mirror, and his stomach was still dropping, and those two facts existed side by side in the specific, exhausting way they had always existed side by side for him, unresolved and unresolvable. Just a condition of the world he moved through. He activated his turn signal. He eased off the accelerator. He guided the Malibu smoothly to the right onto the wide shoulder beneath a flickering amber streetlight and shifted it into park. He turned the engine off. He turned the radio off. John Coltrane cut mid-note, the silence arriving like a held breath. He reached across and rolled down all 4 windows, which was something his father had told him to do, and explained precisely why transparency is armor, when you have nothing to hide, and you will always have nothing to hide. So you will always roll down all 4 windows. He placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He waited. His heart was hammering against the inside of his ribs with a force that he knew was completely invisible from outside the car, because he had spent 7 years learning to make it invisible, learning to let the noise live only on the inside, while the outside remained calm and deliberate and legible. His face was neutral. His shoulders were relaxed. His hands were flat and still on the wheel. The protocol. His father had given it to him the way other fathers gave their sons watches or tools or the keys to a car, as something passed from one generation to the next, not because it was wanted, but because it was necessary, because it was the only instrument available for navigating a particular kind of danger that did not respond to any other approach. Hands at 10 and 2. No sudden movements. Announce everything before you do it. Comply with their instructions even when the instructions are unlawful. Survive the street. His father had paused, then had looked at him across the kitchen table with an expression Marcus had spent years trying to find the right word for. Not sadness, exactly, not anger, exactly, something that was both of those things, and also something older and more complicated than either, and had said, "I will destroy them in the courtroom, but I cannot do that if you do not come home. So survive the street first. Everything else is secondary." Marcus had been 12. He had nodded. He had understood in the way 12-year-olds understand things their parents tell them about the world abstractly, theoretically, as a piece of information about a future version of himself who would need it. He had not understood it yet in his body, in his hands, in the way his jaw set when he heard a cruiser's engine behind him on a dark road. He understood it in his body now. The officer approached on the driver's side, his footsteps deliberate and slow, the specific slowness of a man managing a situation rather than responding to one. The flashlight came before the face, a white beam aimed directly at Marcus's eyes with a precision that made it impossible to look toward the approaching figure without being blinded, and Marcus turned his face slightly to the side, keeping his hands exactly where they were. Keeping his breathing even. The beam held on his face for several seconds longer than necessary. Then the officer's voice arrived. No greeting, no identification, no explanation for the stop. Just the demand delivered with the flat authority of a man who had issued it so many times it had lost its shape. License registration proof of insurance. "Good evening, officer," Marcus said, and his voice came out exactly as he had trained it. Level, unhurried, respectful, without being deferential. The voice of a person who is choosing his tone carefully for specific and reasoned purposes. "My wallet is in my back right pocket, and my registration is in the glove compartment. I need to reach for them. Is that all right?" The officer leaned closer to the window, and Marcus caught the smell of cold coffee and something stale underneath it, and saw in his peripheral vision the second officer appearing at the passenger side flashlight on the interior of the car, hand on the doorframe. The first officer said something that Marcus filed away. "I didn't ask for a speech, boy. I asked for your papers," and Marcus felt the word land, the way it was meant to land, felt what it was designed to do to his composure, and chose not to let it do that. "Yes, sir," he said. He began to reach slowly, deliberately, his right hand moving from the steering wheel toward the glove box, his body angled so that both officers could see exactly what he was doing at all times. The glove box opened. It was a mess in the way that the glove boxes of 19-year-olds always are. Gas receipts, napkins from 3 different fast food restaurants, a charging cable that had not worked in 4 months, a pair of sunglasses in a dark plastic case, and beneath all of that visible. Once you looked past it, a yellow registration envelope with the insurance card paper-clipped to the front. Marcus's fingers moved past the sunglasses case. His hand was reaching for the yellow envelope. On the passenger side, Cole Tanner's flashlight was angled at the glove box interior. The shadows in there shifted as Marcus's hand moved. The dark plastic case caught the beam at an angle that made it look for a fraction of a second, like something else entirely. And in Tanner's mind, which had been flooded with adrenaline for the past 3 minutes, which had been trained by 8 months of Pruitt to read ambiguity as threat, which had been waiting since the moment they pulled out of Langford Drive. For something to happen, the fraction of a second was enough. He had a single beat, one clear beat, where his eyes registered the case for exactly what it was. He knew. Some part of him, the part that had not yet been fully overwritten, knew. And in that same beat, he looked sideways at Pruitt through the car windows, and Pruitt was already moving, already leaning in, already coiled, and the look on Pruitt's face was unmistakable. It was anticipation, and Tanner understood without words or conscious thought that this was the moment Pruitt had been waiting for. That this stop had never been about a lane deviation, and that the only question left was what kind of man Cole Tanner was going to be in the next 2 seconds. He screamed the word before he had finished deciding. The word hit the night air, and everything that followed happened faster than Marcus's mind could fully process in real time, arriving instead as a sequence of sensations and impacts that he would not be able to reconstruct in their correct order until much later. Lying in a hospital bed with his eyes closed, running it back again and again. The way you run back a moment that does not make sense until you slow it down enough to see every frame. Pruitt did not pause. There was no beat of verification, no half-second of assessment, no moment in which a man with 16 years of experience and a sworn obligation to protect the public took the fraction of time available to him to determine whether the threat was real before responding to it. His hand was already moving before Tanner finished the word, not because he had assessed the situation and determined action was required, but because the word was a green light, and the green light had been what he was waiting for. And Wade Pruitt, in 16 years, had never once waited for a green light to reach him. He had always been the one who decided when it turned. His hand found the collar of Marcus's jacket through the open window, the fabric twisting against Marcus's windpipe as Pruitt's fist closed around it, and Marcus felt the pull before he understood it was happening. The force of it yanking him sideways and up out of the seat in a single wrenching motion that gave him no time to brace, no time to prepare, no time to do anything but try to keep his hands visible and his mouth forming the words his father had given him, even as the world tilted. The door opened from the inside. Pruitt's arm had reached through the window and found the latch, and then Marcus was in the air briefly. And then he was not in the air at all, because the asphalt was there cold and wet from a rain that had passed an hour earlier. And his shoulder absorbed the impact with a violence that sent a white-hot shock of pain radiating down his arm and up into his neck, and his cheek hit the pavement hard enough that he tasted blood immediately, though he would not know until later that it was his tongue he had bitten and not something worse. "I am not resisting. I am not resisting." His father's voice in his own mouth, the words arriving automatically from somewhere below consciousness, the deepest layer of his training activating in the moment his body needed it most. He was rolling onto his stomach, his hands spreading flat against the wet asphalt, his legs moving apart wide, obvious, unambiguous, the posture of total and complete surrender, the posture of a person who has nothing to hide and is making that fact as visible and undeniable as a human body can make any fact. Tanner was coming around the back of the car. Marcus could hear the boots on the pavement, fast, heavy. The sound of someone who was not thinking anymore, but simply moving in the direction that momentum and training and 8 months of learned behavior had pointed him. The knee landed in the center of Marcus's back, and the air went out of him in a sound he had never made before, a compressed, involuntary exhalation that was neither a scream nor a word, but something in between the sound of a body being used against its will. His vision blurred at the edges. He could feel Pruitt's weight adding to Tanner's, both of them. Above him, voices coming in choppy and loud and overlapping. Stop moving, stop resisting, stop fighting, none of which made sense because Marcus had not moved, had not resisted, had not fought, had not done anything except try to get his hands into a position where both officers could see them clearly at all times, which was what the protocol required, and what he was still attempting to execute even now, even with 2 grown men's weight compressing his spine and his ribs screaming, and the copper taste of his own blood sitting heavy on the back of his tongue. Tanner's knee pressed down harder, and in the half-second before Pruitt yelled at him to secure the arms, Tanner looked down and saw the back of Marcus's head, saw the 19-year-old underneath him, the university sweatshirt, the hands that were flat against the wet pavement, with the fingers spread wide open in the most universally legible gesture of surrender that a human body is capable of making, and something crossed his face, something that was not quite recognition, but was not quite nothing either. A flicker of the self he had been 8 months ago before he learned to put it away. Then Pruitt's voice arrived like a switch being thrown, and the drawer closed, and Tanner's hands found Marcus's right arm and wrenched it upward at an angle that Marcus's shoulder joint was not designed to accommodate. The taser appeared in Pruitt's hand with the practiced ease of a man retrieving a tool he has used many times before, and Marcus saw it in his peripheral vision and had time to understand what was coming and no time to do anything about it. "I am complying," he said, and his voice cracked on the last syllable, because Tanner had pressed his arm up another inch, and the crack was not from fear, but from the sheer physical impossibility of continuing to speak normally while his body was being dismantled. "I am complying. I am not resisting. I am—" The taser's muzzle pressed against the back of his thigh, and the world became electricity, which is not a figure of speech, but a literal description of what 50,000 volts does to the nervous system when delivered at point-blank range into the large muscle of the leg. Every muscle in his body contracted simultaneously and without his permission, his back arching, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth cracked together, his arms and legs moving in violent, involuntary spasm that had nothing to do with resistance and everything to do with physics. "See? He's fighting," Tanner said, and Marcus understood somewhere beneath the electricity and the pain and the white noise filling his skull that this was how it worked. This was the mechanism that the involuntary spasms produced by a taser were labeled as resistance in real time as they were happening, which meant that anything done to stop the resistance could be documented as a response to a threat that the officer himself had manufactured, and the understanding of this did not help him in any practical way, but it did clarify something about the nature of what was happening to him, which was not a mistake or an overreaction, but a process, an operation with its own internal logic and its own predetermined end state. Tanner's fist connected with the back of his head twice. Closed fist heavy, the knuckles finding the base of his skull, while the taser's after effects still had his muscles locked, and the world went dark for a fraction of a second, a gap in consciousness so brief that he was not certain it had happened until the high whine arrived in his ears, that specific high-pitched ringing that means something in the skull has been asked to absorb more than it was built to absorb. The handcuffs went on with a mechanical click that he felt rather than heard, ratcheted tight enough that the metal bit immediately into his wrists, the circulation to his hands beginning to fail before the cuffs had finished closing. Blood was running from somewhere above his left eye, a gash from the asphalt on the initial fall, and he could feel it moving in a slow, steady line down his cheek and dropping from his jaw onto the wet pavement in dark, heavy drops. Pruitt hauled him upright by the chain of the cuffs, and the pain in his shoulders was immediate and enormous, and Marcus stood because the alternative was being dragged, and he had decided somewhere in the first 3 seconds of all of this that he was going to be upright for as much of it as possible, because upright was a form of dignity, and dignity was the last thing they could not take from him if he refused to give it up. He was shoved against the cruiser's side panel. He leaned against it because his knees were not entirely reliable at this moment. Through the one eye that was not yet swelling shut, he watched Pruitt and Tanner exchange a look across the roof of the car. Not a look of relief, not the look of two men who had just survived something dangerous, but the casual, unbothered look of people who have just finished a routine task and are already thinking about what comes next. To them, this was not an emergency. It was not even an incident. It was Tuesday night in Hargrove Estates, and the paperwork would take maybe an hour, and then they could get back to the coffee they had left sitting on the console. Marcus watched them and understood with a cold and terrible clarity exactly what they thought he was. And he understood simultaneously exactly what they did not know. The Hargrove precinct at midnight had the specific defeated atmosphere of an institution that had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was, a concrete building where certain kinds of problems were processed and filed and quietly disposed of, where the fluorescent lights had been buzzing at the same frequency for so many years that the officers who worked there had lost the ability to hear them, and where the smell of floor cleaner mixed with old coffee, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name, but was at its core the smell of power exercised without accountability in an enclosed space over a long period of time. Sergeant Ray Hollis had been sitting behind the elevated booking desk for going on 22 years, and he had the look of a man who had made peace with his choices by the simple expedient of not examining them too carefully. He was 58 years old, and within 2 years of the pension he had been building toward since the Clinton administration, and the pension was real, and the choices were abstract, and this was a calculation he had made so many times it had stopped feeling like a calculation and had started feeling like a fact of nature. He heard them before he saw them. The double doors opening, the specific sound of Pruitt's boots on the floor, and underneath that, a second set of footsteps that were slower and less steady, the sound of someone walking through pain. He looked up from his paperwork. The boy who came through the door was 19 years old and looked in this moment approximately 12, the way people sometimes look younger when they have been hurt, when the defenses are down, and the age they carry in their posture and their expression has been stripped away by something that was too large for the posture and the expression to absorb. His face was a ruin, the left eye swelling rapidly toward closed, the bruising already coming up in purple-black across his cheekbone. A gash above that eye with the edges not quite closed, still seeping, and his jacket, which looked like it had been nice once, was torn at the shoulder and soaked with street water, and a darker stain that Hollis had seen enough times to identify without wanting to. He had seen this before. He had seen exactly this not once but many times, and the specific nausea that moved through him in this moment was not the nausea of shock, but the far worse nausea of recognition. The sick, tired recognition of something familiar that you have never done anything about, and have therefore in all the ways that matter chosen. He picked up his pen. He asked the standard question about charges. Pruitt rattled them off with the ease of a man reciting a grocery list: felony, resisting assaulting an officer, failure to comply, grand theft, auto pending verification. He gave the boy's ID to Hollis with the casual, proprietary gesture of someone handing over a receipt, and Hollis typed the name Marcus Webb into the system without looking at it carefully, because he had been not looking at things carefully for 22 years, and the habit was as automatic as breathing. No warrants, no priors. The database returned a blank screen with the neutrality of a machine that has no stake in what its results mean to the people reading them. The boy spoke from the railing where Pruitt had parked him, and his voice was clear and steady in a way that surprised Hollis, without his knowing exactly why it was not the voice he expected from someone standing in handcuffs, with blood on his face and ribs that were clearly giving him trouble with every breath. "That is a lie," Marcus Webb said precisely and without heat. "I never fought back. They pulled me from my car and beat me." Pruitt told him to shut his mouth. Hollis told Pruitt mildly to take it easy, mostly for the benefit of the security camera mounted in the upper corner of the room, which he was aware of, in the way that people who do small, indefensible things in front of cameras learn to be aware of them, not enough to change the behavior, but enough to modify the performance of the behavior. Hollis pointed to the wall-mounted phone at the end of the desk and told Marcus Webb he had one call. Pruitt made a joke about public defenders. Tanner laughed. Hollis typed and did not look at the boy, and did not look at the camera, and did not look at any of the 17 things in the room that were, if he had been willing to look at them, actively visible to him. The handcuffs came off, and Marcus Webb stood at the end of the booking desk and looked down at his hands. The marks from the cuffs were deep, purple grooves that had already begun to fill with something livid and unhealthy-looking, the skin beneath them, abraded and raw, and his fingers were still not fully his own, the circulation returning in pins and needles that he could see him trying to work through by slowly opening and closing his fists. There was dried blood between 2 of his fingers from the gash above his eye. His jaw was very still. He looked at his hands for what Hollis counted as about 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds something moved across the boy's face that Hollis did not want to see, and therefore identified only peripherally from the corner of the attention. He was not quite giving. A trembling in the jaw rapidly suppressed the near arrival of something that the boy pulled back from with a visible physical effort. His teeth coming together, his shoulders settling, his breathing going deliberately slow. He walked to the phone. He dialed without hesitation or fumbling a number that lived in his hands, rather than his head dialed so many times from memory that the sequence of digits was just a motion like signing your name. He stood with the receiver held against his ear and his eyes on the floor and his posture very straight, and Pruitt leaned against the counter and watched him with the amused patience of a man who has already decided how this ends and is simply waiting for the formalities to confirm it. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then it was answered, and the voice that answered it was thick with sleep but transitioned to sharp attention with a speed that was itself a kind of statement, the speed of a man who has learned to arrive at full alert from a dead stop because his work requires it and has required it for the better part of 3 decades. Marcus Webb said 2 sentences. His voice was very quiet, and Hollis was not close enough to hear the words, but he heard the quality of the voice, the careful, controlled steadiness of it, and then the single hairline fracture in that steadiness there, and then repaired in the space of a syllable. Hollis went back to his typing. He typed the charges. He typed the name. And then, for some reason, he could not have explained with any precision, he ran a deeper search, not the local database, but the full state system, the one that included family associations, professional affiliations, next of kin records, and he did this not because of anything specific, but because the address on the ID had nagged at him since he first saw it. A downtown high-rise building that Hollis knew the name of, because everyone in the city knew the name of it, because it was the kind of address that appeared in newspaper articles alongside certain kinds of names. The screen refreshed. Next of kin / parent Damon A. Webb. Title State Attorney General. Office of the Attorney General. Hollis's pen dropped. It clattered off the edge of the desk and hit the floor, and he did not move to pick it up. He sat very still and read the screen a second time and a third time, and then he looked up at Marcus Webb standing at the wall phone with the receiver pressed to his ear, and he looked at Pruitt still leaning against the counter with his arms crossed and his expression of comfortable amusement. And he felt spreading through his chest with the cold, unstoppable momentum of something that has been building for 22 years and has finally found its moment, a fear so complete and so clarifying that it was in its own terrible way, almost like relief. He stood up so fast the chair rolled back and struck the wall behind him. Damon Webb had been in room 714 of the Capitol Marriott since 6 that evening. A hotel suite that smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner, and had a view of the parking structure across the street, which was a view that communicated clearly and without sentimentality that this was not a trip anyone was supposed to enjoy. He had back-to-back legislative hearings starting at 8 in the morning, 3 panels, 2 of which were adversarial, and he had been reading the briefing documents in his reading glasses and his pajamas with a cup of cold coffee. When the phone rang. It was a specific phone, not his personal cell, not his office line, but a secure, unlisted number that he gave to exactly 3 people in the world and whose ringtone he had set to something distinct from every other notification on the device so that he would know it without looking from any state of sleep or distraction. He had never received a call on that number and hoped he wouldn't. He answered it on the 3rd ring. The voice on the other end was his son's. He knew it before the first word finished forming, knew it, the way you know, the sound of a thing you love that is not as it should be, the specific quality of a voice held under tight control, when control is very nearly all that remains and everything in him that was tired and distracted and preparing for a Tuesday morning hearing simply ceased to be relevant. He was the Attorney General of the state of Ohio before Marcus finished his 2nd sentence. Not in the sense that he announced it or deployed it, but in the sense that his mind shifted registers the way a transmission shifts gears, smoothly and completely, the processor that handled grief and fear running simultaneously with the processor that handled tactical assessment and institutional authority. Both of them fully engaged and neither of them canceling the other. He asked for the name of the precinct. He asked for the name of the officers. He asked if Marcus could walk and breathe without difficulty. He received answers to all 3 questions and noted them. Then he said, "Put someone on because there was nothing else left to establish between him and his son that words could address, and everything that needed to happen next needed to happen in another conversation." Pruitt took the phone. The approach he used was the approach he used for all the parents and relatives who called the precinct when their family members were in his holding cells, a tone of measured authority laced with just enough condescension to make clear that the person on the other end of the line was speaking with someone who had the power and the inclination to make things worse, and that the most sensible course of action was to accept the situation as presented and negotiate within it rather than against it. He told Mr. Webb that his son was in a lot of trouble. He told him the charges with the brisk confidence of a man who has filed them many times. He suggested with the specific kind of cheerful cruelty that Pruitt had refined over 16 years into something that could pass for small talk that Mr. Webb might want to bring a checkbook when he came down, because the public defender's office worked on their own schedule and Fridays were not typically their fastest. Damon Webb let him finish. And then Damon Webb said, "This is Damon Webb, Attorney General of this state. You have approximately 30 seconds to hand this phone to the highest-ranking officer in that building. If you choose not to do that, I want you to understand that I will remember specifically and in detail this conversation and your role in it. I am asking you one time." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The absence of volume was itself a form of pressure. The silence around each word pressing in on it, giving it weight, the way deep water gives weight to things that float easily at the surface. Pruitt stood up a little straighter without intending to. The grin did not leave his face, but it lost something, a quality of ease, a certain looseness around the edges, and he said, "Look, pal, I don't know who you think you are, but your boy assaulted a police officer, and who, Damon said, has the key to my son's handcuffs." The phrasing stopped Pruitt mid-sentence in a way he could not immediately account for. It was not a question, it did not rise at the end, and it was not quite a demand, though it had the force of one. It was a statement of the next thing that was going to happen, delivered in the tone of a man who has never needed to repeat himself and is not planning to start. Across the room, Ray Hollis was already on his feet. He had covered the distance between his desk and the booking counter in 4 steps, moving with an urgency that was recognizably different from anything Pruitt had seen from him in the better part of a decade. Not the practiced, half-engaged movement of a man going through procedures, but the white-faced, wide-eyed movement of a man who has just understood the geography of the situation he is standing in. He reached Pruitt and took the receiver out of his hand without asking for it, which was something that had never happened in the history of their professional relationship, and Pruitt opened his mouth to object and found that Hollis was not looking at him. Was not looking at him at all. Was looking only at the floor as he pressed the receiver against his ear and said in a voice that was doing its very best not to sound like what it was, "Sergeant Ray Hollis, sir." He listened for approximately 90 seconds. During those 90 seconds, the color left his face in stages beginning at his forehead and moving downward until by the end he was a uniform unhealthy gray that made him look like a man who had been informed credibly and with specificity of his own impending death. His free hand found the edge of the booking desk and gripped it. He hung up the phone. He turned around. Pruitt was watching him with the beginning of something uncertain moving across his face. Not worry, not yet, but the first distant precursor of it, the faintest atmospheric pressure change that precedes affront. Tanner was watching too, and Tanner, who was 26 and had not yet fully calcified, felt the hair on his arms stand up for a reason he could not articulate. Sergeant Pruitt said. The word came out with less authority than usual because Hollis's face was communicating something that authority could not reach. Ray Hollis had spent 22 years not doing the thing that was right when doing it was inconvenient. He had processed arrests he knew were thin. He had accepted reports he knew were shaped. He He had been in the precise and legally significant sense a participant in a culture of protection that had made Wade Pruitt possible, and had made this night possible, and he had done all of it for a pension and the specific comfort of not having to be the person who said something. He reached down and unholstered his service weapon. His hands were shaking, but his aim was not because the distance between him and Pruitt was approximately 8 feet, and at 8 feet aim is a secondary consideration. "Officers Pruitt and Tanner," he said, and his voice shook on the first word and steadied on the second place, "your hands on your heads. You are both under arrest. This building is now under the jurisdiction of the State Bureau of Investigation, and I am instructed to secure you pending their arrival, which I am told will be in approximately 9 minutes." The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had happened in the Hargrove precinct in 22 years. For a moment that stretched and held the way moments do when the people inside them have not yet fully believed that the world has changed. No one moved. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere deeper in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. Tanner's hand, which had been resting on his utility belt in the absent habitual way of a man who carries things on his belt, went very still. Pruitt's response was laughter, not real laughter, but the performance of it, the reflexive deployment of the tool he had used for 16 years to communicate that he was not impressed, that he was not threatened, that the person attempting to threaten him did not understand who they were dealing with. He told Hollis to put the gun down. He called him Greg and told him he had lost his mind. He said it was a prank call, that some kid was playing a joke, that the AG's office was in the Capitol, and did not make calls to Hargrove bookings at midnight on a Tuesday for any reason that would require a desk sergeant to draw a weapon on a 16-year veteran. Hollis did not move the gun. His hands were shaking more visibly now, but the barrel stayed level, and there was something in the steadiness of it that communicated more than the shaking communicated, that the shaking was fear. Yes, but that fear and action were not mutually exclusive, that a man could be genuinely frightened and still be committed to what he was doing. The caller ID traced directly to the state executive's secure grid, Hollis said. The name in the database matches the boy's ID. He is Damon Webb's son, Colton. Now, put your hands on your heads and step back from your weapons, both of you. Cole Tanner moved first, and he did not hesitate when he moved. He did not look at Pruitt before he did it, which would have been the politic thing, the procedurally correct thing within the informal hierarchy they had established over 8 months. He looked at the gun in Hollis's hand, and he looked at Marcus Webb standing against the far wall, watching all of this with an expression that contained improbably more patience than anger. And he unbuckled his utility belt with both hands and let it drop. The sound the belt made hitting the tile floor was loud and final, and deeply satisfying in the way that certain sounds are when they arrive at the end of a long sequence of wrong things, the sound of something being set down that should have been set down much earlier. Cole Pruitt said, and the word came out with a quality that was new, a quality Tanner had not heard from him in 8 months, which was the quality of a man reaching for an authority he has already lost. "What the hell are you doing?" Tanner said nothing. He interlaced his fingers behind his head. Pruitt stood alone with his belt on and his hands at his sides, and the reality of the situation arriving at him in degrees, the way cold water arrives when you step into it first, at the feet, then at the ankles, then relentlessly upward, the whole system recalibrating to the temperature of what is actually true, regardless of what you have been telling yourself. The grin had gone from his face completely, now replaced by something that was trying to maintain the shape of defiance and failing. His jaw was set. His eyes were moving to Hollis, to Tanner, to the camera in the corner of the room, to Marcus Webb against the wall. He removed his belt. He did it slowly, each second of slowness, a small, futile assertion of a self-image that was evaporating even as he performed it, because the performance of authority requires an audience that accepts the performance. And there was no one left in this room who was doing that. Two overnight officers who had come in from the bullpen at the sound of Hollis's voice escorted Pruitt and Tanner to holding cells 3 and 4. The doors closed behind them with the hydraulic finality of heavy steel, and somewhere in the building's ventilation system, a fan cycled on and then off, and Marcus Webb leaned against the concrete wall and breathed. He breathed carefully because his ribs made careless breathing expensive, and he looked at the holding cells at the end of the corridor with one eye that was fully open and one that was nearly swollen shut, and he did not feel triumphant. Exactly. Triumph implies that something has been won, and what Marcus felt in this moment was more like the lifting of a weight that should never have been applied in the first place. Relief and exhaustion and the specific cold clarity of a person who has been very frightened for a long time and has just understood that the next few hours will be different from the past two. His father was coming. The system that had protected Wade Pruitt for 16 years had just turned on him in the space of a phone call, and the machine of consequence was already moving, and Marcus Webb stood in the Hargrove booking room, with blood drying on his face and hands that were just beginning to regain their full feeling, and he waited. They arrived without sirens, which was its own statement, the deliberate total confidence of people who do not need to announce themselves because they have already arranged everything that needed to be arranged before they left the building. 4 black Chevrolet Suburbans unmarked with government plates, and the particular flat black finish that communicates in some wordless but universally understood way that the people inside are operating under a different set of rules than the vehicles around them pulled onto Hargrove Boulevard and parked in a column in front of the precinct with the geometric precision of a formation that has been practiced. The doors opened in sequence. 12 men and women in tactical vests with SBY stenciled in white across the chest stepped out and moved toward the building's entrance without running, not because there was no urgency, but because there was a more important quality than urgency at work here, which was inevitability, and inevitability does not run. Director Anita Coles walked slightly ahead of the main group, a manila folder in the crook of her arm and the expression of someone executing a plan rather than responding to a crisis, which was an accurate description of what she was doing, because in the 40 minutes since Damon Webb's call, she had set in motion 17 separate procedural actions, and the plan was already fully operational before she had gotten in the vehicle. She was 49 years old, the kind of woman who had spent her career being underestimated by people who confused quietness with absence and precision with limitation. And she had learned to find a certain cold satisfaction in the moment when those people understood their error, which was always a moment too late for them. Beside her, Damon Webb. He had dressed in the dark in room 714 in less than 4 minutes, and the result was a trench coat over a dress shirt that was not quite fully tucked, and a collar that was open at the throat and no tie. And even this, the evidence of a man who had dressed in a hotel room at midnight in a state of controlled emergency, read as authority on his particular frame in a way that would have looked deliberately composed on anyone else. He was 57 years old and had the posture of a man who had decided at some point long enough ago that the decision had become structural, that he was never going to allow anyone in any room to doubt whether he belonged there. The Hargrove precinct froze in the way that rooms freeze when something enters them that reconfigures the room's understanding of itself. Not loud, not chaotic, just a complete and involuntary cessation of activity, as if the building had taken a breath and not yet released it. The desk officer who had been mid-sip of coffee set the cup down. The evidence clerk who had been mid-file stood with the file half inserted in the drawer. The overnight detective who had been typing the same sentence for 11 minutes lifted his hands from the keyboard. Damon Webb's eyes moved across the room with the specific, efficient scan of a person who knows what they are looking for and will not be distracted from finding it, and then they stopped. Marcus was in a chair against the far wall, a paramedic kneeling in front of him pressing a gauze pad against the gash above his eye, with the careful, practiced pressure of someone working to close something that does not want to close. His face in the overhead fluorescent light was a territory of damage. The left eye nearly swollen shut, the bruising across his cheekbone and jaw gone deep purple black. His mouth slightly open because breathing through his nose was apparently not reliable at the moment. He was holding his ribs with one hand in the unconscious protective gesture of someone whose body has discovered unexpectedly that it has limits. Damon crossed the room in 3 strides. He moved the way people move when they have been moving toward something for 40 minutes and have finally arrived with the full momentum of everything that had been accumulating since the phone rang in room 714. And then he dropped to one knee on the precinct floor, the Attorney General of the state of Ohio, on one knee, on a Hargrove precinct tile floor that probably had not been mopped recently enough, and he placed his right hand with extraordinary care on Marcus's uninjured shoulder. 3 seconds passed. In those 3 seconds, Damon Webb was not the Attorney General. He was a father who had handed his son a survival manual at age 12 and had hoped with the hope that lives alongside fear in the hearts of parents who understand the specific danger their children face, that the manual would never be needed, and who was now sitting on his knee in a precinct at midnight, looking at evidence that it had been needed and that the needing of it had not been sufficient because the manual was a hedge against catastrophe, and the catastrophe had arrived anyway, just slower and less total than the ones he had been most afraid of. Marcus looked at him. Something in Marcus's face, which had been held at that extraordinary, exhausting stillness for going on 2 hours, shifted. Not collapsed, not broke, but shifted the way a held position shifts when the person holding it is finally in the presence of someone they do not have to hold it for. Damon stood. He turned to the paramedic and asked one question in 2 words. "Is he stable?" and received an answer that included the words concussion, cracked ribs, contusions, and transport, and gave 2 instructions: full SBI, escort to the hospital, and begin immediately. Then he watched the paramedics wheel Marcus out through the precinct's double doors, and he watched until the doors closed behind them, and then he turned to face the room, and the father was gone. Not resolved, not finished, not anywhere near finished, but set aside, compartmentalized with a discipline that 28 years in law enforcement had given him, and that he was now deploying in the specific service of his son. He looked at Director Coles. "Lock the building," he said. "Server access severed now. I want every frame from Cruiser 12 dash cam. Body cam audio on a monitor in 10 minutes. Nobody calls anyone. Nobody leaves." He looked at the overnight officers standing in a cluster near the bullpen entrance, their faces communicating varying combinations of confusion and the dawning understanding that they were present at something that would define the rest of their careers. "Sit down," he told them, not unkindly. "This will take a while." The evidence room smelled like servers and cool air and the particular cleanness of a space where people handle important things carefully, which was an irony that Damon Webb did not register consciously, but felt in some way that lived below thought. Director Coles plugged the encrypted drive into the mainframe with the efficiency of someone performing a familiar task under unfamiliar circumstances, and the monitor at the center of the table came to life, and the room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when the people in them know they are about to see something that cannot be unseen. The footage had not been touched. Coles confirmed the chain of custody in the flat, technical language of someone who understood that the integrity of what they were about to watch was the foundation of everything that would follow it. And then she pressed play, and the screen filled with a dark suburban road. At night, shot from the front of a police cruiser parked at the intersection of Langford Drive and Hargrove Boulevard. The audio came up first, the quiet interior of the cruiser Pruitt's voice in the particular register of a man speaking to a colleague about something that is not urgent, that is in fact casual, a thing so routine that it does not require any adjustment in posture or tone. Damon Webb stood at the monitor and listened to his son being profiled in real time before anyone had spoken to him, before anyone had examined the car, before anything had happened, except that a 19-year-old black student had driven through an intersection in a used car. He listened to Pruitt's voice construct the justification for a stop out of nothing more substantial than inference and predisposition. The word casing arriving with the flat confidence of a man who has used it so many times that it has lost any obligation to connect to observable reality. He watched the cruiser pull out. He watched the lights go on. He watched the camera's feed from above the windshield capture the Malibu's taillights, and then the shoulder of the road, and then the car pulling over with a care and a deliberateness that was visible even at this angle. Even in this light, the signal going on, the speed dropping evenly, the car stopping precisely on the shoulder, the windows coming down one by one. He made himself watch all of it. He watched himself, his advice, his voice, his protocol, the thing he had given Marcus at 12 years old over a kitchen table, being executed perfectly, completely, in exactly the way it was designed to be executed. And he watched it fail to protect his son in exactly the way he had always feared it might fail. Which was not because it was followed wrong, but because the protection was conditional on the officer's willingness to be protected against, and Officer Pruitt had not been willing. He watched Marcus say, "Good evening, officer," with a steadiness that made something in Damon's chest tighten to the point of pain. He watched Marcus announce his movement toward the glove box with the careful, measured advance notice of a person who has been taught that transparency is safety. He watched the sunglasses case visible in the body cam at an angle that showed it clearly and unambiguously for exactly what it was, which was a pair of sunglasses in a case. He watched Tanner scream. He watched what followed without looking away because he was the Attorney General and the evidence was in front of him and his job was to see what was there, and also because Marcus was his son and looking away would have been a form of betrayal he was not capable of. He watched Marcus hit the asphalt. He watched the knee go into his spine and heard the sound his son made, the compressed, involuntary sound that a body makes when it is used against its will. He watched Marcus's hands spread flat against the wet road, fingers wide, the unmistakable physical language of a person who is offering no resistance whatsoever. And he watched the taser go into his son's leg while those hands were still flat on the ground. He heard, "I am not resisting. I am complying," in Marcus's voice. That voice he had known for 19 years in registers he had not heard since the boy was very small. And he held very still because the alternative was something that would not serve his son. When the video ended, Pruitt's laughter, the casual high-five across the roof of the Malibu, the ordinary satisfaction of men who have just finished something they have done many times and expect to do many more. The silence in the evidence room was of a quality that Damon had only encountered a few times in his career, in rooms where something had just become impossible to deny. Director Coles was looking at the table. One of the senior investigators had turned away from the screen and was standing with his hands in his pockets and his jaw working. No one spoke for approximately 15 seconds, which is a long time when the air in the room has the density it had in this one. Damon reached up and straightened his tie, a reflex so automatic he was probably not aware of it, the physical grammar of a man preparing to work. He said, "Prepare the warrants. Federal deprivation of rights under color of law, severe bodily injury. That's count 1. Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The taser qualifies, count 2. Falsifying a police report and conspiracy, count 3. State charges running parallel to the federal, and I want the FBI field office on the phone at 6 a.m. I will personally hand them the federal referral." He looked at Coles. "Bring Pruitt to interrogation room A. I want a few minutes with him." He walked out of the evidence room and down the corridor and pushed open the interrogation room door, and he stood in the hallway for 3 seconds before entering. Not because he needed to compose himself. He was already composed. He had been composed since the moment he arrived, because composition was a choice he had made and was continuing to make. But because he wanted to make certain that the next thing he said to Wade Pruitt was exactly the right thing, delivered in exactly the right way, for the specific purpose of ensuring that the man across the table understood completely and without any remaining ambiguity, what had happened tonight and what was going to happen next. Pruitt had been in interrogation rooms before, but always on the other side of the table, which makes a considerable difference. The difference between a place you use and a place that is being used on you, between furniture that exists for your convenience and furniture that exists for your constraint. The steel table in the center of the room was bolted to the floor. The chair he sat in was bolted to the floor. The handcuffs connecting his right wrist to the steel ring on the table's edge were attached to all of it, and the room's single overhead light was positioned with the specific precision of a fixture that has been placed exactly where it is in order to make shadows fall in a particular way on the face of the person sitting beneath it. He was sweating in a way that 16 years of dangerous work had rarely produced, which was information about the nature of the current danger. His utility belt was gone. His badge was gone. His weapon was with Coles's team in the evidence log. Without those things, without the infrastructure of authority that he wore so completely, it had become indistinguishable from his own skin. He looked like what he was, a middle-aged man in a precinct shirt damp at the armpits, whose primary defense mechanism had just been surgically removed. Damon Webb entered carrying a manila folder. He did not sit down. He stood on the far side of the table and looked at Pruitt with the particular expression of a man who has spent a career looking at people who have done terrible things in the confidence that they would not be held to account, and who has just spent 90 minutes watching video footage of one of those people doing a terrible thing to his son. The expression contained no heat. This was perhaps the most unnerving thing about it. Pruitt's opening was his best argument, and he knew it. The sudden movement, the darkness in the glove box, the partner's call, the obligation to respond to perceived threat protocol training, the split-second nature of the decision, and he deployed it with the compressed urgency of a man who has been rehearsing it in a holding cell for the last hour and needs it to work. Every word was calibrated to sound reasonable. Every phrase was shaped around the word protocol, because protocol is the word that has historically made things like this survivable. The word that converts actions into procedures and procedures into cover. Damon opened the folder. He set 3 photographs on the table, one at a time, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man laying out an argument he has already won and is now simply presenting for the record. The first photograph was a freeze frame from the body cam. It showed Marcus's right hand in full color, reaching toward the interior of the glove box. The yellow registration envelope was visible in the frame, partially obscured by the sunglasses case, which was itself clearly and unambiguously the size and shape and color of a sunglasses case. "This," Damon said, "is my son informing you of his action, moving slowly and reaching for his registration. The plates on that car, which your own radio log confirms you never ran before initiating the stop, are registered to my nephew, who transferred the title to Marcus last spring. There was no stolen vehicle. There was never any stolen vehicle." The second photograph showed Marcus face down on the wet asphalt, both arms spread wide, both legs spread wide, his entire body in the position of maximum surrender. "This is my son, in total compliance, before anyone touched him." The third photograph was the one that landed differently from the other 2, the one taken from an angle that captured both Pruitt's hand driving the taser into Marcus's thigh, and in the same frame Marcus's hands still flat against the ground. And this, Damon said, and paused and let the photograph say the rest of it, because the photograph said it better than any words available to him. Pruitt looked at the photographs. He looked at the table. He said, "I want my union representative. I'm not saying another word until my PBA delegate gets here." Damon leaned forward, placed both palms flat on the steel table, and brought his face to within a foot of Pruitt's. He spoke at barely above a whisper, which was the appropriate register for what he was saying because it was important, and it was also private, intended for one specific person rather than for the room. "Your union representative was contacted 40 minutes ago," he said. "They were given the charges and shown the preliminary footage. They have declined to provide representation. The PBA issued a statement 10 minutes ago distancing the organization from your actions. You are entirely alone in this room, Wade." He watched Pruitt's face process this. The processing happened in stages first. A flicker of disbelief, then the specific blankness of a man whose last structural support has been removed, then something that was trying to be defiance and could not quite arrive there, because defiance requires a foundation to stand on. Pruitt's hands, which had been lying flat on his side of the table, with the cultivated casualness of a man who has decided not to appear afraid, had begun to tremble slightly, and this was not a decision. Trembling is not a decision, which meant it was the truest thing currently visible in the room. "You thought you were dealing with nobody," Damon said. "That was your calculation, and I understand the logic of it, because the logic has worked before. You stopped a boy in a used car on a dark road in a suburb where people like him do not live, and you have always known that the machinery of this institution tends to produce outcomes that favor the person with the badge over the person without it. You have been right about that repeatedly for 16 years. I have your internal affairs file. I have seen the complaints. I have counted them 14 in 16 years, all closed, all bearing my predecessor's signature or Captain Ferris's notation." He straightened. He buttoned the top button of his jacket. "But you made a specific error tonight, and I want you to understand it clearly before I walk out of this room. You did not assault a citizen on a dark road. You assaulted my blood, and I am not a predecessor whose signature you can rely on. I am the Attorney General of this state. I am the system you have been using for 16 years, and I am going to spend the resources of that system, every single one of them, making certain that you do not see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the next quarter century." Pruitt said nothing. His hands were shaking openly now, and his jaw had gone rigid in the way of a man trying to keep something from coming out of his face. Damon picked up the folder, turned, and walked to the door. He pulled it open far enough that Pruitt could see into the hallway the 2 FBI agents in charcoal suits who had arrived from the field office 20 minutes ago carrying federal warrant documents and a second set of handcuffs, and then he left the door as it was and walked away. And the last sound Pruitt heard before the agents entered was the distant, unhurried rhythm of the Attorney General's footsteps moving down the corridor toward something that was already organized and already in motion. Captain Doug Ferris had been stripped of his command in front of 11 subordinates at 2:17 in the morning, and the humiliation of it, the specific public humiliation of being stood aside by a federal director, while your own people watched and did not intervene because there was nothing to intervene against, had not yet become abstract enough to manage. He had been walked out of the precinct without his access badge and driven home by one of Coles's agents who had said nothing during the 15-minute ride and had watched him go inside his house with the neutral, observational patience of someone who had been told to deliver the package and confirm delivery. He sat in his car in his own driveway at 2:45 in the morning in his uniform, with his hands on the steering wheel, running the calculation that panicking men run, which is not really a calculation at all, but a series of rationalizations arranged to resemble one. The federal team was in the building. They had the servers. They had, presumably, the footage. But Ferris had been managing situations involving Wade Pruitt for a long time, and the management had worked consistently because the key variable in all of it was the cooperation of the people who were asked to remember things a particular way. And Hollis was the person who mattered most right now, and Hollis was still reachable. He pulled a burner phone from the center console. A habit, not a plan. The reflexive preparation of a man who has operated in the informal spaces between documented procedure long enough to understand the value of untraceable communication. He dialed Hollis's personal cell. What Ferris did not know was that Ray Hollis had been sitting in the SBI Mobile Command Unit since 2 a.m. fully cooperative, having surrendered his phone and signed an initial cooperation agreement before Ferris's car had even left the precinct parking lot. What Ferris also did not know was that Director Coles, who anticipated exactly the call that was now occurring, had arranged for Hollis's phone to be answered in a way that would capture whatever was said on it without alerting the caller. Ferris's instructions were specific and brief. Vouch for Pruitt's character. In any interview, locate and destroy the backup evidence drive in the evidence room's secondary storage unit, for which Hollis still had the master key, and understand that the alternative was Ferris, testifying that Hollis had personally authorized the ghost files, the encrypted complaint records, as a management tool, which was a lie comprehensive enough to damage Hollis seriously and possibly terminally, regardless of its verifiability. He finished speaking. There was a pause. And then a voice that was not Ray Hollis's said, "Captain Ferris, this is Director Anita Coles. I want to thank you for being so precise. The recording is very clear." The burner phone hit the center console. Outside the windshield, Ferris's residential street, which had been empty and quiet, was suddenly not. 3 unmarked Suburbans had materialized from somewhere from around the corner, from the darkness at the end of the block, from wherever federal vehicles wait when they are waiting, and they moved simultaneously, boxing his car in from 3 sides with the geometric certainty of a tactic that had been prearranged. The engine of his own car was still running, which was irrelevant. 2 federal agents were at the driver's door before he had fully processed that they were there. He did not unlock the door quickly enough, which had consequences, and he was on the wet asphalt of his driveway in a bathrobe he had changed before sitting in the car, which seemed important at the time and seemed absurd now, with his hands cuffed behind him and his Miranda rights being read into the cool night air in a voice that was practiced and uninflected and completely indifferent to the fact that the person receiving them had spent 22 years in law enforcement and knew every word. Across town, in a room at Hargrove General Hospital, a nurse told Marcus Webb that his father was on his way and would arrive within the hour. Marcus said, "Thank you." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the white acoustic tile, the fluorescent light above the bed, the IV line running into the back of his left hand. And then he closed his eyes carefully, because closing them fast still hurt. He let his shoulders drop. He let his jaw unclench. He breathed in a long, slow, deliberate breath that cost him something in his ribs and was worth every cent of it. He let himself, for the first time in 2 hours and 43 minutes, simply exist in a place where no one was going to hurt him. The SBI's forensic team moved through the Hargrove precinct with the methodical thoroughness of people who have been given both the authority and the time to be thorough, which is a combination that produces results of a particular quality, not dramatic, not loud, but comprehensive in the way that only comes when the people doing the work are not under pressure to make it look a particular way, only to find what is actually there. The servers were imaged first, full sector-by-sector copies, made before anyone examined the contents, because the first priority is always the integrity of the source material. The filing cabinets in Ferris's office were photographed before they were opened, and then opened and photographed again, and the contents removed and logged with the specific, unhurried patience of a process that is building a record that will need to survive challenges from people whose livelihood depends on finding something wrong with it. The evidence room was sealed and inventoried. The shift logs for the past 18 months were pulled and stacked. What the team found in the official record was in itself unremarkable, which was the point. The official record of the Hargrove precinct looked like the official record of any reasonably functional suburban police department, with the normal distribution of traffic stops, property crimes, domestic calls, and the kind of low-level disorder that attends any community of sufficient size. The arrest statistics were good. The clearance rates were good. The complaint numbers were within the range that a department of this size and staffing level would be expected to produce. What they found in the shadow of the official record was the story that the official record had been constructed to obscure. 34 traffic stops of black drivers in Hargrove Estates over the preceding 18 months. The number was not itself remarkable. The precinct covered a large geographic area, except that Hargrove Estates had a documented black residential population of less than 4%, which meant that the distribution of those stops was not random and not proximity-based, and did not correspond to any rational model of where enforcement activity should concentrate if its purpose was the reduction of traffic violations. 29 of those 34 stops had resulted in either an arrest or a citation. 11 of the 29 had generated excessive force complaints in the period immediately following the stop. All 11 complaints had been closed within 1 week of filing. All 11 carried Ferris's notation, insufficient evidence, complaint resolved, file closed. But the complaints themselves had not been destroyed. This was Ferris's error, or perhaps not an error, but an insurance policy, a hedge against a future in which he needed documentation of what he had done and why, and it was the error that would cost him the most. Because in an encrypted folder on a drive registered to his personal workstation, maintained separately from the official department network, were the original complaint files complete and unaltered, including witness statements and body cam request logs, alongside a separate document in Ferris's own word processing software that contained his personal notes on each case. The notes were methodical and specific, and read in sequence constituted something that was not just a record of individual suppressions, but a policy, an ongoing, deliberate, documented policy of managing the consequences of Pruitt's behavior to protect Pruitt's productivity. Because Pruitt's arrest rate was a significant contributor to the statistics that made Ferris's precinct look good, and looking good produced budget allocations and commendations and the forward movement of a career. The forensic accountant on Coles's team found the financial dimension 2 hours into the server review. Recurring deposits into Ferris's personal account from an LLC registered in Delaware, $400 to $800 monthly, consistent over a period of 3 years, traceable with the time and tools the SBI now had to a bail bonds operation, whose primary client base was people processed through the Hargrove Precinct's booking system. The operation's revenue was directly correlated with Pruitt's arrest volume. Ferris was not just Pruitt's institutional protector, he was his financial partner. Hollis sat in the mobile command unit and gave his statement for 3 hours. He named every case he had processed without question, every report he had received without examining it carefully, every moment in 22 years when he had understood what was in front of him and chosen to understand it less clearly than he was capable of. He was not performing contrition. Contrition is a performance, and Hollis was beyond performance at this point. Sitting at a folding table in a trailer at 4 in the morning, in a precinct jacket he had not taken off because he was cold. He was simply accounting for things that had been unaccounted for, with the exhaustion and the strange relief of a man setting down a weight he had been carrying for so long that he had stopped noticing its shape. He signed the cooperation agreement. The immunity it granted him was limited and conditional, and he understood its limitations and conditions completely, and signed it anyway because the alternative was not available to him anymore. Not because of the legal exposure, but because the version of himself that had made looking the other way feel manageable had looked at Marcus Webb's face in the booking room and had not been able to reconstitute itself. Damon Webb received the briefing at Hargrove General, sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway outside Marcus's room with a cup of hospital coffee that he was not drinking while Marcus slept for the first time in 18 hours behind the closed door. Coles's summary was thorough and took 12 minutes. When she finished, Damon Webb sat quietly for a moment with the cup balanced on his knee and said, "I need Marcus Linden from the DOJ Civil Rights Division. Get me his cell." He paused. "And get someone to call the 11 families." 3 days after the arrest, Cole Tanner sat in a federal holding facility interview room that was smaller and more aggressively fluorescent than any room he had sat in before. Across a metal table from a man named Marcus Linden, who was an assistant United States attorney with the Department of Justice, and who communicated without stating it directly that he had been doing this for 15 years and had a high threshold for being surprised by anything a person in Tanner's position was going to say. Tanner was 26 years old and looked it in a way he had not quite looked it before, the specific youthfulness of a face from which a certain practiced hardness has been removed. Without the uniform, he looked like what he was, which was a young man who had made several specific choices over the preceding 8 months, and was now sitting in a room that was the direct product of those choices. Lyndon laid out the charges the way a contractor lays out materials before beginning work methodically, without embellishment, establishing the scope before addressing any particular component. Felony deprivation of civil rights under color of law, which carried a federal mandatory minimum. Assault with a dangerous weapon, the taser for which Tanner's own body camera established both presence and physical contact. Conspiracy because the stop itself had been manufactured and Tanner had been in the cruiser when it was manufactured and had said nothing. The sentencing guidelines for these charges in combination, Lyndon said, placed the likely outcome in the range of 12 to 15 years in a federal facility. Tanner had prepared a version of this conversation in his head. He had prepared the version where he explained that he was a rookie and that Pruitt was his training officer, and that the culture of the precinct and the dynamics of the probationary period and the split-second nature of the situation in the glove box he had prepared. All of it assembled it into something that resembled a coherent account of a person who had made understandable errors under pressure. Lyndon waited until he had finished. Then he reached into the folder beside him and placed a single photograph on the table. It was a freeze frame from Tanner's own body camera. The timestamp was in the upper right corner. The angle captured the moment approximately 3 seconds after Marcus Webb's shoulder had struck the asphalt, 3 seconds into the event that had followed from Tanner's scream, and in those 3 seconds, Marcus's hands had already moved to the flat spread position of surrender. His fingers extended his palms down, visible and unambiguous, in the light of the flashlight that was also visible in the frame. The angle captured Tanner's own eye line clearly. His eyes were open. His eyes were pointed directly at Marcus's hands. The photograph said in the language of evidence that Cole Tanner had seen what Marcus Webb's hands were doing in the moment before the violence escalated, and that he had continued to escalate. Tanner looked at the photograph for a long time. He did not look at Lyndon. He looked at the image of his own eyes looking at an empty pair of hands, and he felt the specific sensation of a thing you have been managing. Keeping at distance, keeping in the drawer, felt it, arrive in the room with him undeniable and present, no longer something he could put away. He said nothing for long enough that Lyndon checked his watch. The offer Lyndon set on the table was a plea, guilty to felony deprivation of civil rights, with a full and honest cooperation agreement, covering everything Tanner knew about Pruitt's conduct, Ferris's conduct, and the culture of the Hargrove precinct over the preceding 8 months. In exchange, a recommendation of 6 years with eligibility for supervised release at 4. No conspiracy charge, no weapons enhancement. Tanner asked one question: was the same offer available to Pruitt? Lyndon said that Pruitt had refused all cooperation, had demanded trial, and was currently telling his public defender-assigned attorney that Tanner had initiated the gun call without provocation and had delivered the unauthorized strikes while Pruitt was attempting to de-escalate. Tanner's face did a thing. Then that was not quite surprise. A flicker of confirmation. The specific expression of a person who had feared something specific and has just been told that the thing they feared is exactly what happened. He had known that Pruitt would do exactly this. He had known it in the way you know things about people after 8 months of close proximity, when you understand not just their habits, but the calculus underneath them, the specific arithmetic of a man who has always, in any situation where 2 outcomes are available, chosen the one that costs him less, regardless of what it costs anyone else. He had spent 8 months learning from that man. He had spent 8 months becoming the kind of person who could be in a cruiser with that man without objection. And he was 26 years old, and the next 30 years of his life were sitting on a table in a government room under fluorescent lights, and the only path through them that was not USP Hazleton ran directly through the truth. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady in the way that hands are steady when a decision has been made beneath thought, and the hand is simply executing it. He signed his name in 3 places with the full, unhurried signature of someone who is not trying to make the act smaller by performing it quickly. The sound the pen made on the paper was not dramatic. It was just a pen moving across a page, producing a name that would become 6 months later one of the most consequential pieces of testimony in a federal civil rights trial. The sum total of what it felt like was exhaustion, not relief, not redemption, just the particular exhaustion of a thing being finally over, combined with the particular weight of understanding that the thing being finally over was not an ending, but a beginning of a different and harder kind. Lyndon walked Tanner to the door when they were done. In the hallway there was a window at the end of the corridor, and through it the morning was visible. Early light, pale and non-committal, the specific quality of dawn that makes no promises about what the day will do. Tanner stopped walking for a moment. He stood at the window and looked at the light. Then, he kept walking. 6 months after a Tuesday night on Hargrove Boulevard, the federal courtroom on the 4th floor of the Grantham building had the specific quality of a room where something of significance is about to happen, and everyone in it knows it. Not chaos, not theater, just a heightened, almost architectural density of attention, the kind that makes a room feel larger and smaller simultaneously, the way important rooms always do when they are occupied with their full purpose. The mahogany of the bench and the gallery rails absorbed sound in a way that the Hargrove precinct's concrete had never done, the room's materials communicating in their own wordless idiom that the proceedings here carried a different weight than the ones conducted under fluorescent lights in rooms that smelled of floor wax and old coffee. The federal seal behind Judge Patricia Okafor's bench, a woman of 61 with a reputation for absolute intolerance of institutional dishonesty and the judicial temperament to operationalize that intolerance in ways that withstood appeals, was not decorative. It was a statement about jurisdiction and permanence, and the particular seriousness with which the federal government treats the abuse of the authority it grants. Wade Pruitt sat at the defense table in a county-issue suit that was a size too large and hung off him with the specific shapelessness of clothing that was chosen for its function rather than its fit. 6 months of county lockup had taken a toll that was visible and specific, the weight gone from his face and his frame, his hair thinned at the temples in a way it had not been in August, his color, the indoor gray of a man who has spent several months without natural light. Without the uniform, without the utility belt, without the architecture of authority that had defined his visible self for 16 years, he occupied space differently than he had on the side of Hargrove Boulevard, as if the physical infrastructure of his confidence had been load-bearing all along, and its removal had left the structure uncertain of its own dimensions. In the front row of the gallery, Damon Webb sat in a dark suit, with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the front of the room, and beside him, Marcus healed in the visible sense, the bruising gone. The gash above his eye reduced to a faint line, his posture easy and upright, wearing a dark blazer over a white shirt. His presence in that front row, its own argument, the living rebuttal to everything Pruitt's attorney had attempted to construct over 3 days of trial. The trial had been, in the assessment of the legal press covering it, a difficult experience for the defense, which is the gentlest way of describing what had actually happened. A USA Lyndon had built his case the way a skilled mason builds a wall, not rapidly, not dramatically, but with a patience and a precision that produced something that did not shake when pressure was applied. The ghost files were in evidence. The financial records were in evidence. Hollis's testimony, delivered in the flat, specific, uncomfortable language of a man accounting honestly for his own failures, was in evidence. The original 11 complaints were in evidence alongside the documented fact of their suppression. And then Tanner took the stand. He had waived his right to a screen or a remote appearance. He sat in the witness box in a federal facility uniform and looked at the jury, 12 people who had heard 3 days of testimony. and who were in the specific way of people who have absorbed more information than they perhaps wanted about the ways that power organizes itself to avoid consequence, looking back at him with the careful attention of people who understand that what they are about to hear will matter. He described 8 months. He described them in plain language without the technical vocabulary of institutional justification and without the softening vocabulary of self-excuse, because Lyndon had explained to him in their preparation sessions that plain language was his only available asset, and that he should use it as if his life depended on it, which in the relevant sense it did. He described the informal curriculum of working with Wade Pruitt, how to identify a stop worth making, how to write the paperwork around the stop you had already decided to make, how to read Pruitt's silences as instructions, how to understand that the metrics that got you good evaluations and the actions that produced those metrics existed in a relationship that it was not career-enhancing to examine too carefully. He described the night in question in sequence moment by moment with the specific, uncomfortable precision of a person who has been living with the sequence for 6 months and knows every beat of it in the way that regret makes you know things. He described the cruiser in the dark driveway. He described seeing the Malibu and seeing no violation. He described the lane deviation call. He described the approach. He described the glove box and the shadows and the sunglasses case and the half-second when he knew when some part of him that had not yet been fully overwritten had registered the case for exactly what it was, and then had looked at Pruitt through the car's interior and seen Pruitt's anticipation and had screamed the word anyway. The jury room was very quiet. Lyndon then played the footage, the unedited body cam and dash cam recordings, on a large screen that was visible from every seat in the courtroom. He played them without commentary, because the footage was its own argument. An argument would have diminished it. The courtroom watched Marcus Webb pull over with perfect, careful compliance. It heard his voice saying, "Good evening, officer." It watched his hands on the wheel. It watched him announce his movements. It watched the violence arrive, and it heard the sounds the violence made, and it heard, "I am not resisting," in a 19-year-old's voice, while the footage showed 2 men using him as a surface on which to express something that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with the specific cruelty of power exercised without accountability in the dark. 3 jurors were crying before it ended. The jury foreman was looking at the table when the footage stopped the particular expression of a person who has just seen something they cannot find an adequate response to and has chosen honesty over performance in the absence of an adequate one. The defense attorney's cross-examination of Tanner took 14 minutes. She found no ground to hold. She knew the photograph existed, the freeze frame of Tanner's eyes looking at Marcus's empty hands, and she knew the jury had seen it, and she sat down without having dislodged anything that had been established. Pruitt's own testimony was the most revealing thing that happened at the trial, which was not what it was intended to be. He was a man who had spent 16 years in a professional context that rewarded confidence and had never been presented with a situation in which confidence and truth were sufficiently divergent that the gap was impossible to bridge. The gap here was not bridgeable, and watching him attempt to bridge it with protocol, with training, with the vocabulary of split-second decision-making in dangerous circumstances was to watch a set of tools being used on a job they were not designed for. Lyndon's cross-examination used 3 exhibits and 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He asked questions that already contained their own answers and allowed Pruitt to either confirm them or contradict the footage, and Pruitt did neither cleanly, and the jury watched that too. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 57 minutes. "Guilty," the foreperson said on each of the 7 federal counts in sequence, reading from the form with the flat steadiness of a person who has made a decision they are prepared to stand behind. "Guilty, guilty, 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 guilty." The courtroom did not erupt. It made a sound that was almost a sound, an exhalation, collective, involuntary, and then went back to stillness because the stillness was what the moment required, and the people in the room were by and large people who understood what the moment required. The week between verdict and sentencing was a week that happened in two different registers simultaneously: the institutional register, where the paperwork of consequence was being completed and the administrative machinery of justice was processing its outcomes, and the human register, where the people who had been inside this story for 6 months were beginning to understand what it meant to be on the other side of something. The Hargrove Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree 3 days after the verdict. The decree was comprehensive, covering hiring practices, traffic stop documentation requirements, complaint, processing timelines, body camera policies, and the creation of an independent civilian oversight board with actual authority, rather than the advisory-only authority that such boards typically receive when departments design them themselves. The decree's terms were public, which was the point: not a private correction, but a documented commitment with monitoring and teeth. The precinct's leadership was removed and placed under federal administrative oversight, pending the selection of new command staff through a process that Coles's office would supervise. Ferris's plea was formalized the same week. 8 years federal facility. His pension, the thing he had been building his entire career, the thing he had built his entire relationship with Pruitt around protecting, was seized in full and directed toward a restitution fund for the families of the 11 people whose complaints he had buried. The number he had paid to maintain Pruitt's operation came back to him in the specific form of the thing he had valued most, which is a form of poetic justice that is also beneath the poetry, simply arithmetic. The corruption was funded by stolen safety, and the restitution was paid in stolen security, and the balance came out even in the way that balances rarely do. Hollis retired quietly on a Tuesday, his pension intact under the terms of his cooperation agreement, and he did not hold a press conference and did not speak to reporters who called and did not respond to the requests for comment that accumulated in his email inbox over the following weeks. He drove away from his precinct at 8 in the morning and did not look back at the building and the people who were watching. The SBI agents who had been in the building for a week, the 2 remaining overnight officers who were waiting to hear what happened to their department, watched him go without ceremony, because ceremony was not what the moment called for. Tanner began his sentence at a medium-security federal facility in the southern part of the state. On his first morning, he was assigned to the facility's vocational education program, a practical choice made by a case manager who had looked at his file and seen that he was 26 and had 8 months of law enforcement experience and nothing else that translated directly into a post-incarceration life. He was given a workbook on the first day. He sat at a desk in a classroom with 7 other people and opened the workbook to the first page and sat with it for a while, looking at it in the way you look at the beginning of something long, when you are at the beginning of it and can see the full length of what is ahead of you, but not yet its end. Marcus returned to the university the week after the verdict. He walked across campus on a Wednesday morning with his backpack on and his Coltrane on the CD player through earbuds, and the campus was exactly as it had always been. The familiar sequence of buildings and pathways, and the particular social ecosystem of a large research university in the middle of an ordinary academic week. And he was in it the way he had always been in it, which was as someone who belonged there and knew it and was not going to be argued out of it. A professor who taught his studio elective, a woman in her 50s who had clearly seen the coverage and had thought about whether to say something and had decided that not saying something was its own kind of position, stopped him in the corridor outside the studio and asked if he was all right. He said he was fine and that he had a lab at 2 and that he was glad to be back. She nodded. She let him go. The night before sentencing, Marcus and Damon sat at the kitchen table of their downtown apartment and ate dinner together, a meal Damon had picked up from a restaurant 2 blocks away because neither of them had been grocery shopping recently enough to have anything that required actual cooking. They ate and they talked about a documentary they had both been meaning to watch, and Damon poured 2 glasses of water, and Marcus told him something about the clinic model he was revising for the spring semester, and Damon asked a question about the load-bearing issue, and Marcus explained it. And outside the window, the city moved through its evening the way cities do without particular reference to what was happening in the apartment above it. Marcus went to his room after dinner. He sat at his desk. He opened a document on his laptop that was blank, and he did not write notes or an outline or a draft. He simply began to type because the statement had been in him for 6 months and did not need to be drafted, only released. He wrote for 40 minutes. He read it once. He closed the laptop and went to bed. The courtroom on sentencing day was fuller than it had been at any point during the trial, which was itself a statement about what the community understood to be at stake in this particular proceeding. The civil rights advocates were there, and the journalists and 3 state legislators who sat together in the middle of the gallery and whose presence communicated in the language of institutional positioning that this was a moment people in power had decided they needed to be visibly aligned with. The families of the 11 people whose complaints had been buried were there, seated in a section near the front that had been reserved for them, and their presence was its own form of testimony. The living evidence of what the tape had not captured, what the ghost files had documented, and then hidden, what the precinct had been doing for years before it did it to Marcus Webb on a Tuesday night in August. Judge Patricia Okafor took the bench at 9 a.m. with the particular economy of motion of a person who has done this for many years and understands that dignity in a courtroom is communicated through the absence of performative flourish rather than its presence. She was 61 years old and had the eyes of someone who has spent a career looking at the distance between what people do and what they claim to have intended, and who has learned to find that distance interesting rather than merely depressing. Wade Pruitt was at the defense table. He had been brought from the federal detention center where he had been housed since the verdict, and the transition showed not in his posture, which he was still managing, but in the smaller things, the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved around the room without landing anywhere with the old proprietary comfort. He was present in the room, the way people are present in rooms they have no claim on, which was a different kind of presence than the one he had occupied for 16 years in rooms where the badge was the claim. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the front row where Damon Webb sat beside his son, and his not looking at them had the quality of an effort, not passive, not incidental, but active. A maintained avoidance that communicated precisely what it was designed not to communicate, which was that looking at them was something he could not afford to do. Judge Okafor confirmed the administrative record of the verdict, acknowledged the presence of the families of the additional victims identified in the investigation, and then looked toward the gallery. "The court recognizes the victim in this matter," she said. "Mr. Marcus Webb, do you wish to make a statement?" Marcus stood. He was wearing the dark blazer over the white shirt, and his posture was easy and straight, and when he walked to the podium, he walked with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who is not in a hurry because he has already arrived. He put both hands on the edges of the podium, looked at Wade Pruitt for a moment with an expression that was not anger and was not forgiveness, but was something more precise than either of those things, and then he began. He did not begin with Officer Pruitt. He began with the drive. He described what it was like to be 19 years old and driving home from a late shift at the studio, tired in the good way that comes from a long day of work you chose to do with Coltrane on the CD player, and your mind on a load-bearing calculation, and 4 minutes between you and your bed. He described the specific piece of that moment, the ordinary, unremarkable piece of a person moving through their own life, going home minding their own concerns. He described what happened to that piece when the lights appeared in the mirror, the drop in the stomach, the reflex, the survival math. That begins automatically, involuntarily, the moment the blue and red start strobing. Because growing up the way he had grown up in the family he had grown up in with the father he had grown up with. That math was not abstract. It was a practiced, lived, deeply embodied thing. He described his father's voice. He described the protocol not as a list, but as a presence. His father's voice inside his own head, narrating every step as he executed it, the 10 and 2, the windows, the announcement of every movement before it was made, the courtesy and the care and the extraordinary exhausting effort of a person doing everything exactly right, and the specific horror of discovering that doing everything exactly right was not sufficient because the officers who had pulled him over had not been looking for violations to adjudicate. They had been looking for an opportunity to exercise something that had been building in them for a long time and needed a surface to land on, and he happened to be the surface available that night. He spoke about the asphalt. He spoke about the sounds his body made. He spoke about repeating, "I am not resisting," while both men's weight was on his back and the taser burned into his leg, repeating it not because he believed it would stop anything, but because he needed there to be a record in the air in the night, in his own voice of what was true, because the truth needed a witness and he was the only witness he had. Then he paused. He looked away from Pruitt and looked at the gallery, at the families in the reserved section, at the journalists, at the legislators, at the people who were watching, and beyond them, at the camera in the back of the room that was transmitting this to people who were watching from places far from this courtroom in their cars and their offices and their living rooms. "I want to ask a question," he said, "and I need you to sit with it honestly rather than rush past it. What if I had not been the Attorney General's son?" He let the question be a question. He did not answer it immediately. He let it occupy the room for a full beat because the question deserved the space. What if I had been a 19-year-old kid working the overnight at a grocery store with an hourly wage and a public defender who got my file 2 days before the hearing and had 14 other files on his desk? What if I had the same innocence and the same compliance and the same perfect execution of everything I was supposed to do, and the only difference was that the phone call from that booking desk reached someone who could not reach back? He looked at Pruitt. "We both know the answer. I would have been convicted. Your report would have stood. The complaint I filed would have been sent to Captain Ferris and would have come back in a week marked insufficient evidence and placed in a folder that no one was supposed to find. And I would have spent the next several years of my life, the years when people are supposed to be building their futures, carrying a felony record that I did not earn for a night that should not have happened." He paused. "You have done this to other people. The record shows it. The 11 families sitting in this room know it in a way that no record can fully capture." The room was very quiet. He looked at Pruitt for the last time. "You did not break me," he said. "You hurt me, and you frightened me, and for approximately 2 hours on a Tuesday night, you had complete power over my body and my immediate future, and you used that power in the worst way a person entrusted with it can use it. But you did not take my future from me, and you did not take my father's faith in me or mine in him, or either of ours in the idea that what happened to me on that road is not how this is supposed to work, and that the distance between how it is supposed to work and how it worked that night is a distance worth spending your life trying to close." He removed his hands from the podium. He turned and walked back to his seat. Damon Webb reached over and put his hand on his son's shoulder and did not let go. The room held its breath for a moment longer, and in that moment, something that was neither silence nor sound occupied the space. The specific atmospheric quality of a truth having been told in a room full of people who needed to hear it and knew it and would carry it with them when they left. Judge Okafor allowed the room several seconds to settle before she spoke, which was itself a form of respect, an acknowledgement that what had just been said deserved time before anything was added to it. Then she looked at her notes, and then she looked at Pruitt. And then she began. She did not begin with the sentence. She began with something that the statute gave her discretion to address, which was the nature of the conduct itself and the position from which it was carried out, because the federal sentencing guidelines for civil rights violations permit a judge to consider the full context of the offense before applying the enumerated factors, and Judge Okafor had things she needed to say. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, and her voice had the quality of a judge's voice when a judge is speaking to the record rather than merely to the room, clear, precise, unhurried, the kind of voice that understands it will be read long after the people in the room have gone home. "You were given a badge and a weapon and the authority of this state, and you were trusted to use those things in the service of the people who live here, all of them, without exception and without qualification. The law does not create a category of citizen to whom that service is owed conditionally, and the oath you took did not contain a footnote. You had 16 years. 16 years of daily choice, daily opportunity, and what you built with those years, as this trial has documented in detail, was a practice, not an error, not a series of lapses, but a deliberate and ongoing practice of identifying the people in your jurisdiction who were least likely to have the resources to effectively contest your actions and using that identification as a criterion for whom you policed. She looked at the 11 families. The women and men sitting in this courtroom today are part of your record as much as any arrest you made that appeared in the official statistics. They filed complaints. They described in writing in signed statements what you did. Those complaints were suppressed with the assistance of others whom this court has separately addressed, but the suppression does not erase the fact. It only deferred this moment. She looked back at Pruitt. You have asked this court for consideration of your years of service. I have considered them. 16 years of service that included the deliberate abuse of authority over citizens who deserved its protection is not mitigation. It is the precise measure of how long this was allowed to continue, and, consequently, it is an aggravating factor rather than a mitigating one. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked at the sentencing form. On the federal count of deprivation of rights under color of law resulting in severe bodily injury, I sentence you to 10 years to be served in a federal facility. On the count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, I sentence you to 10 years. On the counts of falsifying a federal law enforcement record and conspiracy, I sentence you to 5 years. She paused. These sentences are not to be served concurrently. They are consecutive. The total term is 25 years to be served at USP Hazleton. You will not be eligible for early release consideration. The number landed in the room the way large numbers land in large rooms with a specific quality of weight, a physical sensation, almost the air rearranging itself around the information. A reporter in the second row stopped writing. 2 of the 11 families held each other. Pruitt did not collapse. He sat very still for several seconds longer than the circumstances would seem to call for a stillness that was not composure but its opposite, a temporary paralysis, the nervous system of a man who has just received information too large to immediately process, holding everything in suspension while the processing occurred. His hands, which were cuffed at the wrist and resting on the table in front of him, began to tremble. He looked at them the way you look at part of your body when it is doing something without your permission, with the specific dissociated expression of a person who has arrived at the outer edge of their capacity to manage their own experience. Then the processing completed, and what came through it was not composure and was not defiance and was not anything that the 16 years of performance had prepared him for, and it showed on his face in a way that those years could not contain. The federal marshals moved to the table. They were practiced and efficient. Pruitt was upright and moving before the room had fully registered that the moment was over, walked through the rear holding door, with the specific economy of motion that correctional transport uses, not rough, not gentle, simply functional. The door closed behind him. Damon Webb watched the door close. Then he turned to his son, who was watching it too, and father and son sat together in the front row of the gallery, with the specific quiet of 2 people who have traveled a very long distance and have just arrived somewhere that is not exactly a destination, but is unmistakably no longer the road. The marble steps of the Grantham building were wide and white, and in the midday sun they had the warm, slightly blinding quality of surfaces that were designed for photographs, and there were a great many cameras at the bottom of them, when Damon and Marcus walked out through the heavy glass doors and into the light together. They did not stop. They walked down the steps at the pace of 2 people who are going somewhere specific and have decided that this particular space between the doors and the car is not a place where they have anything to add. The microphones extended. The questions began overlapping and competitive. The usual questions: reaction to the sentence, message to other officers, plans for civil action, thoughts on what this means for the department, and neither of them slowed or turned or acknowledged the bank of cameras with anything more than the simple physical fact of continuing to walk. At the bottom of the steps at the waiting town car, Damon stopped. He opened the rear door and then turned and looked at his son. Not at the courtroom version of Marcus, not at the victim's statement version, not at any performed or presentational version, but at the actual 19-year-old standing in the midday light with his jacket over his arm and his hair slightly wrong and his eyes carrying the specific quality of someone who has been through something large and has come out the other side of it without having been made smaller, and he said something. He said it quietly, intended for Marcus and not for the microphones, and it was not the kind of thing that needs to be reported, because it was a private thing between a father and a son, the kind of thing that lives in the space between the public story and the real one. Marcus answered. They got into the car. The door closed. The cameras filmed the empty steps for a while after that. 6 months later, at 11 p.m. in the university studio, Marcus Webb was at his desk with his jacket over the back of his chair and the smell of spray fixative in the air, and John Coltrane on the CD player through a speaker that still had a faint buzz in the lower frequencies that he had long since incorporated into the texture of the sound. He was finishing a revised version of the community health clinic model, the spring semester version, the one that addressed the load-bearing issue on the south wall, and his hands were steady, and his mind was on the work, and the work was good. On the corkboard above the desk, among the sketches and the reference images, and the material sample cards and the post-it notes with calculations on them, there was a single photograph. It was a photograph of his father in court clothes, standing outside a building in the winter light, looking at something outside the frame. A classmate passing through the studio glanced at it and asked in the casual way of people who notice things without intending to make a moment of them who that was. My dad, Marcus said, and went back to the south wall. 1 year after the consent decree took effect, the Civilian Oversight Board of the Hargrove Police Department held its quarterly review in the precinct's conference room. The room had not previously hosted this kind of meeting. The chairs were mismatched in the way of chairs that have been gathered from different rooms rather than purchased as a set, and someone had brought coffee in a cardboard carrier from the place 2 blocks over. And the conversation was difficult in the specific way of conversations that are trying to change institutional habits in real time, which is the hardest kind of change there is, and it was ongoing, and it was necessary, and it was happening. At 11:34 p.m. on Hargrove Boulevard, a black woman driving home from her shift at the hospital moved through the intersection of Langford Drive and checked her mirrors and saw a cruiser parked at the corner of the hedgerow and felt the familiar drop in her stomach and kept her speed exactly where it was and her hands where they could be seen. The cruiser did not move. She exhaled. She drove home. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something you didn't expect to feel, or reminded you of someone you know, or made you think about who gets protected and who gets left unprotected, and what it costs either way, then let us know in the comments, because those conversations matter. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to ask one honest question and sit with it, 25 years was the sentence. The 11 people who filed complaints before Marcus Webb did what was theirs.